Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is already the 23rd of April, and so for my own sake we're going to keep this video brief, but there is really important news to cover that has developed over the past few hours, and that is the fact that the Russian forces now are confirmed to have control over much of Ocheretyne, including the fact they raised their flag over the central parts of the town. And so we're going to really do an explanation of how we reached this point, how the Russians were able to break through the Ukrainian lines at such a fast pace, and particularly at this point in time. And we're going to look at the significance of Ocheretyne and what the future holds due to this Russian success. And so we could go back and see the beginnings of this Russian advance in the northern section of the Avdiivka front within this red rectangle on the 14th of April, which was now 9 days ago. And that is when the Russian forces started putting pressure from their positions to the north of Berdichi along the rail line towards the Ukrainian positions in trenches and within the houses in the Zaria agricultural center, where you have some dachas. And so that was a Ukrainian forward gathering point. And so the Russians started putting significant pressure on the Ukrainian forces that were occupying those strongholds. The reason why they did it at this point is because in early April, in the first week of the month, there was a troop rotation. The 47th Mechanized Brigade, which is the unit that has fought in the summer counteroffensive, and since late October, was moved to the front line from Zaporozhye to defend the northern flank of Avdiivka. And since then, it has not had any sort of rest. It did have rest in between the counteroffensive and Avdiivka. And when the Battle of Avdiivka really started to heat up in January, February, this unit engaged in less fighting because they were more so focused on the northern flank. But nonetheless, they did not have an extended period of time where they could rest, recuperate, get additional manpower, and train them in an effective way. And this is the result that now they're heavily attrited and that they're running low on ammunition after fighting for many, many months on this part of the front line. Again, chronic shortages in infantry, like in many other Ukrainian brigades, and just general fatigue. And so they were supposed to be rotated out for we don't know how long, but at least for a certain period of time, so they could be relieved. In the 115th Mechanized Brigade was supposed to take over that role of holding the line around Ocheretyne. And so they started occupying trenches and different apartment buildings in Ocheretyne, including the Zaria dachas, in the early parts of April. And the Russian forces were aware of this rotation, and that may have been a catalyst for them to increase the pressure in this region to gauge the strength of the new Ukrainian defenders. And so when they did this, upon the first interactions with the Russian forces, the 115th Mechanized Brigade already began to abandon their positions that were really centered around the line of contact. They were pushed back along the rail lines all the way to Ocheretyne by the 16th of April. And so by the 16th of April, you already had Russian forces from the 30th Motor Rifle Brigade. This is the unit that has been involved in all these Russian advances that I'm going to talk about. They advanced along the rail line, took over Zaria and all of the nearby tree lines, and made their way to the southeastern outskirts of Ocheretyne along these particular trenches, as was verified by all the geolocated footage that I've talked about in earlier videos. And really, the 115th Brigade has a history of abandoning its positions. It was formed in March of 2022, and currently it consists of mainly mobilized soldiers. Again, they lack the same willpower to fight as other units, and they are less trained and perhaps more lightly equipped. They abandoned, some of their platoons at least, abandoned their positions during the Battle of Severodonetsk before the higher command that was in charge of conducting, the troop composition on the battlefield gave them the orders to retreat. And so it's not the first time that they've really abandoned positions in this way. They were also involved in the Kharkiv counteroffensive, where they did have some success, but now it's been more than a year since then, we haven't seen the unit actually being utilized on the front line. So it appears that it did have infantry shortages and was being reconstituted over that time. And now the new recruits, they're experiencing the realities of the battlefield for the first time. And that's likely why they immediately started to withdraw from their forward positions. And now the result of that is that the Russian forces by the 16th of April had positions on the outskirts of the village. And after 2 days of back and forth, where you saw the 47th Mechanized Brigade called back to defend and conduct localized counterattacks, eventually that was not enough, and the Russian forces from the 30th Brigade were able to establish a foothold in these southern buildings in the southern section of the town. And this is despite the fact that the 47th was moved back in. The 47th, of course, heavily attrited, and so their fighting force, their capabilities aren't the same, and they don't have the same counterattacking capabilities that they may have had several months ago. And you really see how the 47th lacks this counterattacking capability, or really any other Ukrainian unit that's stationed around here, which we'll get to, based on the fact that they were unable to coordinate counterattacks on the flanks that tried to cut off or fire upon the routes which the Russian infantry and their various, ancillary supply units moved through to actually reach the battlefield in Ocheretyne, because at least on paper, the front line of the Russian forces have paved. Their vector of advance does look thin, but in reality, there isn't a strong enough Ukrainian body near the line of contact to put enough pressure to actually close down this Russian advance. And so the Russian forces, of course, took advantage of that and moved in additional forces along what appears to be, on paper, a very narrow strip of land, advancing, 6-7 kilometers to the northwest, and send those forces to continue fighting in Ocheretyne. Now, in the first week after the Russian forces conducted this breakthrough, so you could say like from April 16th to like April 20th, so in that 4-day span, you did have heavy Ukrainian resistance from the nearby echelons that came in to defend. And I'm talking not about, on the ground counterattacks, I'm talking about the various responses from artillery, mortars, and drone crews. We absolutely did see the Ukrainians try to organize and fire what they had at their disposal. And so we saw that in some of these videos of shelling of Russian houses, where the Russians were stationed, and drones dropping grenades onto Russian soldiers in trenches. That all happened, and there were fierce battles as a result. And there's satellite imagery from 1 or 2 days ago showing heavy fires in the southern section of the residential areas. But over the past day or so, we've seen it die down after the Ukrainians expended a lot of their artillery, and now it seems that they're trying to ration a lot of it. And eventually, as of 21st of April, it was confirmed that the Russian forces had full control over the southern section of the town. And then we saw additional confirmation based off of a video from the 47th Mechanized Brigade showing their Bradleys engaging with Russian infantry within the western outskirts, with the Bradley vehicle actually firing towards those Russian forces at close quarters. And then there was another Bradley that was engaged in the front line fighting around Novobakhmutivka to the south. And so that's verification that the 47th Brigade is back in full force, or at least what it has remaining, and it's using its equipment that it has at its disposal. And now the key development, before we get to that, the 47th Mechanized Brigade, they also reported that in the area between the Avdiivka coke plant, so that's located here, and the village of, or town of Ocheretyne, which if we measure it, it's about a 10-kilometer span going to the northwest. They report that on a daily basis in this section of the front line, the Russian forces are dropping 20 to 30 fab bombs on the Ukrainian positions. And that's not even the entire Avdiivka front, it's only the northern section of this sector. And that just gives you an idea of the vast air power that the Russian forces are utilizing and using to target the Ukrainian defenders. And that's something that absolutely happened around Ocheretyne. Here's just one example of 2 fab strikes on the Ukrainian positions in apartment buildings in the northeast of the town. And there were talks about some Ukrainian soldiers not even being found, not even being recovered after 2 weeks of being under the rubble in these strikes on the apartment buildings in Ocheretyne, the targeted positions of the 115th Brigade. And so that also played a role in, targeting the Ukrainians as they're preparing for the defense in this town, further disintegrating the cohesiveness of the defending units. And so despite some efforts by the 47th of counterattacking, this was not enough, and due to the aforementioned issues with that unit that caused it to have to be rotated out in the first place, eventually the holes were exposed in the Ukrainian line, and the Ukrainians are now reporting. So you have Deep State saying that most of Ocheretyne is a gray zone, which would imply that some of these trenches on the perimeter of the town are now being evacuated by the Ukrainians. They still say the apartments over here are under Ukrainian control, and so there is ambiguity about whether this northeastern portion is being held by Ukrainians. But what we do know is the Russian forces were able to cross the rail line and advance several hundred meters north. We can measure it over here. It's an advance of 200, 300 meters north of this rail line. And what you see is 8 Russian soldiers being filmed raising their flags. Here's the video of the Russian soldiers, and then there's another video of one Russian soldier raising the flag over the Ocheretyne administrative building, which gives confirmation of the Russians in the central part of the town. And the Russian soldiers themselves report that today particularly was a quiet day in relation to the past week where there was heavy Ukrainian artillery fire. And so that is also further confirmation that the town is being cleared of its Ukrainian presence. So before recording, I did a brief counting of the Ukrainian units that are located generally around the northern sector of Avdiivka, but I gave it some leeway to include Ukrainian units that are nearby that could, in theory, have some of their, companies moved in to hold lines in theory. And so really I was measuring this entire area of the front line. If I were to measure it, it's like a 20-kilometer front line. And in this region, I counted that at the moment you have the confirmation of 4 active Ukrainian battalions fighting on the front line. And I'm saying battalions as separate from brigades because when I say battalions, I'm talking either about independent battalions or battalions that are part of brigades that the brigade itself are not fighting in Avdiivka, but have one of their battalions at least fighting on the Avdiivka front. And so you have 4 separate battalions, you have 7 brigades, and then you have 4 brigades that I consider to be outdated because there's not evidence that they've been fighting on the front line over the past 2 months. So maybe they're still active in this region, maybe they were rotated out, maybe some of their elements are in reserve and others aren't. We don't exactly know, but we do know for sure that there are 7 Ukrainian brigades that are generally located, and I'll mark it again for you guys in blue, in this region over here from Novokalinova, Alexandropil, and then going south to Semenivka that should be operating in this region. And despite that fact, there was still a gaping hole in the most important parts of the sector, which is Ocheretyne. Ocheretyne should be the most well-defended parts of this front line because of the significance that I'll get to later on in the video. But despite that fact, there was a hole, particularly in this part of the line, that the Russians were allowed to exploit, and no other flank on this northern sector is strong enough to actually push back the Russian vector. And if you guys are wondering more specifically about the Ocheretyne village and the brigades around it, then you can narrow it down to 5 brigades that are generally operating nearby. You have the 68th Jaeger Brigade, a unit that was recently moved in again and is likely operating around Novokalinova, Keramik, this entire area north of the rail line. Also 71st Jaeger Brigade. Of course, we have the 115th, which we talked about ad nauseum, and the 47th Mechanized Brigade. And then you have the 129th Territorial Defense Brigade, which we have seen less of in recent months, but is still thought to be operating on this northern flank near Berdichi, for instance. And then further south, you have additional Ukrainian units that, of course, are needed to hold the front line around a place like Semenivka or Romanske. And that's also a part of the problem, the fact that the Russian forces in early April were putting pressure further south around Romanske and Semenivka. That diverted a lot of Ukrainian attention away from Ocheretyne. And so some of the valuable infantry that was still fighting in this direction was not involved in defending Ocheretyne at a key time. And it's further compounded by the fact that you had some Ukrainian defenders that were diverted, their attention was diverted away due to Russian attacks that were subsequently occurring around Novokalinova and Keramik and continue to occur due to the pressure coming from the 228th Motor Rifle Regiment to a certain extent, but more so from the 15th Motorized Rifle Brigade. So really my point with all of this was to show that the Ukrainians, at least on paper, do have a lot of units that were moved into this area, especially in late February, in order to prevent the total collapse of the Ukrainian lines on the Avdiivka sector, and in order to facilitate a retreat of the Ukrainian forces out of that city. But in reality, you do have a manpower shortage, but in particular an infantry shortage in every single one of these units. And I can't quantify it with a specific number, that would be lying, but it does show itself with the reality on the ground based on what we're looking at right now in Ocheretyne. And on the other hand, the Russian side, they have a strategic reserve on the Avdiivka front, so their units are able to rotate out more frequently, and when they are rotated, as a general rule, they are able to afford being rotated out for a longer period of time. So as I was saying, the Russian push on the Ocheretyne is being conducted by the 30th Motor Rifle Brigade. They were really involved in the attacks on the coke plant, for instance, in the end of February, and then they had a period of rest where they weren't really involved in the action, and only now they're being reintegrated into the fighting and playing a key role. At the same time, you have the 27th Motorized Rifle Division, which is a new unit which you've likely not heard of, and it's now in the process of formation, and that's because the Russians are taking the 21st Motor Rifle Brigade. So they're taking this unit and they're converting it into an entire division. So what's going to happen is, at least on paper, there's supposed to be 3 motorized rifle regiments a part of this division, and this will create a new strategic reserve on the Avdiivka front that has not still been used to engage in frontline activity. And so once some of these other units, like the 30th and the 15th, are eventually traded over a long period of time and fatigued, then you could have some elements of this new division that's being formed sent in to fill the gaps. And of course, I have to mention that on this front, you have several BARS units, which are, again, these volunteer reserve units that the Russians have been utilizing a lot during the past 2 years. And you have the 1st Army Corps, the DPR. They have various units that are either fighting right now around Orlivka and Semenivka, or fought around Avdiivka and have not really played a big role in the fighting since then. So they have had a period of rest and could be moved to help the Russians continue with their offensive activities and exploit the gap that was created in Ocheretyne in the coming weeks. And so now with the capture of the town in process, I won't say it's fully captured because it's not, but with the Russians advancing in this direction, there is an opportunity to exploit this success to yield even further gains. And so we're going to look at how this could happen. And so the issue is, when you look at the elevation, Ocheretyne is really a linchpin for the Ukrainians because it was located on the predominant height in the entire region that overlooks the groupings that are currently under Ukrainian control to the north around here, to the northwest around here, and to the south around here, for instance. And if you look even further south, it overlooks the current Ukrainian line of defense, which is basically based on Umanske, Semenivka, and whatever's left of Berdichi. And so now the Russians are getting that under their control. So the Russian forces are not only flanking the current Ukrainian front line, but they're also overlooking all of it. And they're overlooking all of the trenches that the Ukrainians built. They're also overlooking all of the trenches the Ukrainians built to the north, where you would expect the Ukrainians to retreat to now that they've lost Ocheretyne. And the Russians are also flanking and could in the future continue to flank to even larger extent all of these fields that are located to the east of the Vavcha River. And so the Vavcha River is going to be really important in the coming weeks. I'll mark the Vavcha River for you guys in blue. The Vavcha River, the Ukrainians, they, in the back of their heads, knew that eventually it would come to the point where they have to withdraw past this river, which is a natural barrier where they do have heights to the west of it, the Ukrainians. They do have trenches to the west of it. And so it's not the end of the world that they would withdraw past it, but the Ukrainians would like to, of course, extend their window of time east of the river before eventually having to withdraw. But now their various fallback lines east of the Vavcha River are in serious danger due to this Russian push along with Ocheretyne, because now the Russian forces are going to have access to the rail line and can continue pushing along that rail line, getting control of additional heights and additional fields on the northern flank. And from there, the Ukrainian positions that are located throughout these various fields that, I guess if we measure it for the sake of scale, I'll do this. Right now, the Ukrainians have like a 10 or 9 kilometer wide strip of open fields with various fallback lines, including villages, sometimes valleys and tree lines in between that are supposed to just drag out the withdrawal over a staggered period of time. Now, all of that is being exposed from the north due to this Russian advance and could preempt the Ukrainians to be pushed back further westwards across the Vovch River at an earlier time. Additionally, there is threat of the Ukrainian garrison stationed in Kramik and Novokalinove. You could see how they could be flanked due to the 15th putting its pressure from the east, and then the 30th putting pressure from this western direction. And this would also put pressure on the various trenches that the Ukrainians have built up in this region, and they were built up in this specific reason to defend from the south. And you can see that visualized with these 3 arrows, but the irony is now they're being flanked from a different direction. So in any case, this puts the Ukrainian forward garrison here in danger, and it would also put, in terms of elevation, the Ukrainian garrison further north and the various trenches around it that are marked in this red rectangle around Arkhangelsk in danger as well, just based on the elevation difference. And just looking forward at the bigger picture, now the Russian forces are going to be more comfortable moving artillery systems towards Avdiivka because, again, Ocheretyne acts as a buffer to the northwest of Avdiivka. And so they're going to move more self-propelled howitzers that are going to get closer and closer to various Ukrainian positions on the rear, various Ukrainian logistical routes, including highways that go to and from Pokrovsk. And of course, when you're using longer range artillery and longer range MLRS systems, then it could actually hit Pokrovsk itself, which is a major transport hub, a major command hub in the southern Donetsk front at the moment. And now that is on the table for being targeted. And of course, a lot of these Russian attacks that are going to continue in the coming weeks, they are being bolstered by the fact that the Russian forces are now going to be able to turn Avdiivka into a logistical node. Now that, again, the line is being moved further and further away from Avdiivka, Avdiivka could turn into a rail hub. The Russians need to reconstitute the rail infrastructure in Avdiivka and get it connected to the wider rail system in Donetsk city itself. And that would streamline the process of moving in additional reserves and moving in additional heavy equipment towards the line of contact to assist with the frontline activities. And so that's all for today. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.